Thank you for that. So thank you, Rob, and all of Tableau for having me. And thank you all. It's an area I'm interested in, but not one that I'm that familiar with, so I've really enjoyed the day learning from all of you. And I hope I can offer something back to you. So, yes, I did my doctorate in comics form. It's entirely written and drawn that way, and it's now this book. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of it and a little bit about sort of how you think in comics and some of my own process. And then I try to keep it kind of tight, and then we'll maybe do some questions, and then we're going to end by drawing. So that's the plan. And if I get behind, somebody in the audience is going to make sure that we draw. So here we go. I have a clicker. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you a lot about my backstory except to make a point here. I'm somebody, like probably many people in my generation, that grew up reading comic books. I had a much older brother who read them to me, so as a result, like Batman is my first word because my literacy came through comics. As somebody who teaches with them, I think the sort of anecdotal evidence that they are a gateway to literacy has certainly been true. And so I made my own comic quite a bit through junior high and high school. I produced my own character, who did make a reappearance in the dissertation itself. So I don't know how many superheroes have been drawn into dissertations, but I have. And it was really an extremely important thing to me, both as a child and as a young adult. But when I went to school, I wanted to do intellectual things going to school, and comics were certainly not seen as that. And I think it's only now that we're starting to think about it that way. And so I went to school. I studied mathematics, which I really enjoyed, and I don't regret that at all. But comics stayed in the background. And I think one important thing I want to say about that is if you're a mathematician, and I know there's some in the room, I think when you tell people that, they say, oh, you're really smart. And when you're an artist, which I'm now, I guess, people say, oh, you're really talented. And I feel like the divide in those things, when I think of myself, I think I was a very talented mathematician. I could do lots of very clever things, but I don't know how smart I actually was at it. And I think as an artist, I think my art is extremely smart, but there are certainly people who draw stronger and better than I do. So I think a part of my work is to sort of break down those divides between smart and talented and sort of reconsider that. So comics stayed in the background. I kept making them, but it was always on the side. Until I was in Detroit, I did a lot around the arts there, and I was asked to be in a political art show around the 2004 election. And I turned back to making comics, and my solution my goal in making this comic was how could I make something that people could read that didn't agree with me already? How could you speak across the aisle? So I really used the comics form and turned to visual and verbal metaphor. So in this particular one, it's all about elections or, a show of hands. And so the whole comic is using this hand, we're showing hands the whole time and trying to take out a lot of the language that keeps people apart. So I continued that. This is a little teeny excerpt from a comic I did for an exhibition we did on games and art. And what I discovered in doing is that I could do extremely complex things, but make them accessible through the use of visual metaphor, through the popular culture imagery, that I didn't have to dumb it down, that I could actually make it more sophisticated by the way I used image and text and the whole space of the page. So that really became the thing. So when I went to Columbia University, I said, this is the kind of work I want to do. I don't want to be an academic that sits inside academia. I want to make my work that people read and that impacts people. And they bought it. So from the very start, not all my homework, but most of my work there was done in comics form. So I sort of built the argument while I was doing it. And I could continue to do this thing with metaphor so that it was could be read by anyone. And this piece is about one of my teachers, Maxine Greene, is a philosopher of aesthetic education. It was in her 90s when I made this about her. And I'll show you one more before we get to the work itself. This was a piece for a book on narrative research. And one thing I strive for in this by taking out the language, this was both a comic, depending on who read it, it was either a comic book about how we see, or a comic book about how we draw, or a comic book about research. And it really depended on who you were because of the use of metaphorical language, which was both very precise and also intentionally ambiguous. So I want to tell you about my work, Unflattening, but I'm going to tell you a lot more about it than the work says itself. I'm going to over-explain it a little bit. So, like I said, I called this unflattening, and by unflattening, I didn't mean something literal, but I really meant sort of a flatness of our possibilities, where our choices were already made for us, where we lacked a critical dimension to sort of step out of our surroundings. And I think, to me, it was about forgetting what might be and being trapped in how things are. And because I already had the word, and the word actually came from how I think about comics, but I'll talk about that later, I connected it to Edwin Abbott's Flatland. And I'm guessing a few folks in the room have read this, 1880s novella? A few nods, all right. Doesn't matter if you have or not, but in Flatland, it's the story of the geometric inhabitants of a two-dimensional world. So they know how to move east, and they know how to move west and south and northwards. But they have no concept of upwards. They have no idea about things that are off their plane of existence. And so we can all look down at them and say, well, that's kind of silly. But the question we want to ask is, what is upwards to you and I? What are directions that we can't see? What are directions we can't even fathom going because of the limits of our own seeing, which become the limits of our own thinking? I was in the School of Education, so my work is very much, even though, like I said, I don't say it, very much of thinking about education. And I feel a lot that the institution of education, and this has come up in conversations here, fosters a kind of flatness. The sort of recipe, the steps that we take, I think limits who we can be. And I feel like the boxes that our learning is broken up into, whether it's the box of the space, whether it's the box of subject or the box of time, I think we take the complexity of who we are and we put it into boxes. So somebody who says, I was an artist and I was a mathematician and I happened to be a tennis player, that's an odd thing in our culture today. But I don't think it's that. I think that's an artifice of culture, not how things are really odd. I think we've limited ourselves by these kinds of words. So the push was, my fear of how to push back against thinking being lined up. And because I was in the academy, I was very particularly concerned with the form of scholarship, and which is what we're all pushing against that. So I'm in a friendly audience here. But why is 12-point type, double-spaced, 1 by 1 by 1 by 1.5-inch margins what good thinking is supposed to look like? And I really like Scott's example of how Playfair was sort of maligned. I think that's still happening today. And I think we have this distrust of images as being anything but objects or but pictures on the wall, but prettiness or aestheticness. That goes as far back as Plato, who called images shadows of his shadows. And it goes to Descartes, who distrusted the senses at all and was much more comfortable with us being thinking machines rather than bodies that moved, that felt. And if we think about any time we try to represent our reality, we have no choice but to flatten it. We have no choice but to take all this complexity and flatten it down. So if you think about the Mercator projection, forget that. If you take the globe, and you flatten it down, you all know that the Mercator projection distorts things. You know Greenland isn't that big, right? And so you can look at the second one here. This is Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion map, where he puts it onto an icosahedron first and then unfurls it. So where the map we're used to seeing shows separations, Fuller's map shows connections. That doesn't mean it's any more accurate. It just means that it's representing information differently. In the same way, if we say, what's the weather like outside, and you only tell me the temperature, we're not looking at humidity. We're not looking at the wind. So anytime you only look for one channel, you're leaving out all the other possibilities. And so that became the big question: is what are we not seeing? What are we not able to see? And what might we start to make visible when we bring in other ways of knowing? Which I think is obviously what you're all here doing. And I made this sort of aside, which I think became a big part of the work, is I talk about seeing and I talk about visual, and I work in a visual medium. But I really think that by ways of seeing, I meant ways of knowing. So I liken it to my dog. And so the dog, you guys all know the dog's sense of smell is stronger than yours and mine. But what's really important about the dog's sense of smell is that it's more nuanced, which means I come up to this podium and I see it's wood, I see it's got chips in it, but that's about all I know about it. I can see its appearance. A dog comes up to this thing and knows who spoke here last, knows who spoke here this morning. Its sense of smell can probably take it back 7 days to know layers of time that I have no access to. So I see that as a kind of upwards. And as an educator, I think when we encourage that, when we bring those sorts of things in, that makes us see farther. It makes us see deeper. And so the unflattening was this incredibly simple idea for me, is that your two different eyes are giving you two different pieces of information, and they have to work together. And they work together to expand your understanding of the world. And I think that's an idea about displacement. Rather than being in one spot, when we start to come from multiple vantage points, when we start to step out of ourselves and come from another place, we expand what it is we can see. And we don't, of course, have to stop at two. We can see from many, many vantage points. And so that simple idea, when we come from multiple points, we're no longer looking at things head on. We see that they have sides. We can turn them around. We can turn them over. We can maybe even open them up. So for me, comics was this thing that I loved to do, but it also became very clear this is a thing that's allowed me to be amphibious. I could breathe in the worlds of both image and text, and maybe just get at some of the boundaries of my own thinking. Maybe get outside of some of the ruts that my own thinking was, that I would have been trapped in. And so I want to turn here to talk about comics a little bit more specifically. And we had a conversation about this last night. I don't know what people think of in this room when you think of comics. How many comics readers do I have here? Oh my, all right. This is a prime. How many graphic novel readers do I have in this audience? Did some of you raise your hand for one and not the other?
What's the difference?
What's the difference? Anybody want to answer it before I do? Marketing. I'll just answer it. We don't. You guys want to catch your bus. It's marketing, and it's an effective marketing. I mean, so when I say I did my doctoral work in comics form, people look at me and then they say, "Oh, you mean a graphic novel?" And I say, "Okay, fine." But the thing is, I think comics are something that is A, quite old, and B, I think it's part of a lineage of things that we've been doing as long as we've been human. We've been trying to make sense of our world visually since we were us. And that's not at all saying that this is a comic book. But it is to say that this is an important literacy, and it's an illiteracy that's not encouraged in education and really quite absent. And I think what you all are doing is introducing it in a really important way. And I wasn't going to talk about history of comics at all, but Scott's talk this morning made me think I should just say a few words about it, so I threw in a few slides. And I just look at things that aren't comics, but could have been comics. This is the Bayeux Tapestry, which is like 70 feet long, I think. And it's got a lot of things you might recognize as comics. This is an illuminated manuscript, so preset type. Words and pictures interacting in a pretty direct way. And this is the first thing that wasn't called comics at its time. At the Swiss, Rudolf Topfer, around 1800, this was done. And this very much starts to resemble things that we call comics. It's sort of alone in history a little bit. And then this is the first use of the word cartoon, which comes from the Italian, and Enrico should tell us how to say this better, but the word for cardboard, which is something like cartone, which meant the preparatory sketches, the material that the old masters drew preparatory sketches on before they were put into the plaster to make murals. But that word, sort of for preparatory sketches, became this thing we call cartoons, which now has connotations that are far from the old master's sketches. And again, because of the plate Scott showed today, newspapers, this is the Yellow Kid, what's called something else, but around 1898. And I think when the photo engraver printing became possible, all of a sudden you wanted to use it. And you wanted to put drawings in here. And the early Yellow Kid comics are sort of mix of type and comics. But very quickly it started to take over. And this is Winsor McCay, Little Nemo. And this is about 1908. But these are huge, and these guys were celebrities. I mean, this was a big deal in their time. They were very wealthy people. So comics was a very booming thing because it made newspapers money. And I'll say just two more things about the history, and we'll get back to This is the first thing that anyone can actually call a comic book, something with a little stapled spine to it. And the reason this exists is because they had all these newspaper comics that were coming out, and people started putting them into anthologizing them and putting them into books. And the printers were running, but they wanted to run their printers 24 hours a day because they could make more money, so they needed more content. So comic books are not created because somebody thought comics were a good idea. Comic books are created because printers needed something to print. So then all of a sudden, They made these things called comic books. And shortly after, this is 1938 and 1939, things you recognize. And we won't do any more of the history, but I think what's really interesting about comics, unlike film, is that comics kind of got subsumed by things like superheroes and funny animals. And so when I say, what do you think movies are, you don't just think romantic comedies. You think documentary. You can think of the wide range of it. And for most of comics history, most of it's sort of 1900s history, 20th century history, you think of them as something for children at best. And certainly many things I could list, but Mouse in 1986 and Scott McCloud's 1993 Understanding Comics have really paved the way for things like what I've gotten to do. And I know Scott was a guest here a few years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about how comics work, or how I think they work, because everybody who makes them thinks a different thing. And I think this will connect a lot to the stuff you do. And so we'll start with Scott, because he should be the place we start. And so Scott's definition, juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. And we talked about sequence earlier in Jessica's talk. So very basically, if I take my fist here and I draw a box around it, and I put my fist here and draw another box around it, you guys all make the action happen. Comics are a static medium. Nothing happens in them. But the reader animates it in their heads. And that's one way we can think about time. So you went from the morning session to the next session to the next session, so there's in that sort of sequence. And that's a big part about how comics work. And so you can see it on this page. We read left to right, top to bottom. It's very much sequential in the ways that text unfolds. But because it's visual, because you can see it all at once, you can't help but start to make connections from the lower right back up to the upper left. Which means something different is starting to go on. And even within the panels, which do you read first? Who reads the words first in a comic? Couple? Who reads the pictures first or looks at the pictures first? And who has varying strategies? So the fact that I can ask a question about how you read something has just changed what it is. So the comic is this whole space that things making unusual connections across it, which makes my joke possible. So I want to talk about that more. This is from Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And I think this center panel here is really wonderful meta-commentary on how comics work. And he says, there is no future, there is no past, you see. And so in some sense, the upper left, certainly in reading order, comes first. But because we take it all at once, this is much more like a sort of crystal or something. We see it as different facets. And so in fact, the lower right corner is taking place 30 years before the events of the upper left. So the time and space is mashed together in an unusual way on the comics page, which makes a lot of storytelling possibilities, opens a lot of storytelling possibilities. And I liken this, we won't talk a lot about left-right brain stuff here, but except to say that I think the current theory on them is that they're not so much about visual and verbal, but about two kinds of attention. So one kind of attention needs to be focused on linear tasks, we do this, to this, to this. But the other one has to be sort of roaming all the time to be aware and make connections, which is very important. If I'm focused on something, if I don't have something pay attention, that's when I get eaten. And so you can think about this in your own life. So right now we're having this, we're here, you're thinking about what's going to happen next, marching through time. But things I've said are probably suggesting things that go sideways. You're thinking about things you have to do later. So you're both marching simultaneously through time, but you're also having this you're marching sequentially through time, but you're also having these simultaneous thoughts that are going sideways. They're very hard to think about in terms of, when are they happening, because they're happening all at once. So let's look a little bit about how some comics do this. It's a comic about the Louvre. So I could cut it up into 9 panels, and you could read them separately. But I think you would miss what's going on behind. And I think you see the whole all at once, something, particularly if you know what the Louvre looks like, that super image ties it all together. This is from Gasoline Alley from around the 1930s. And so you'll see our characters sort of sequentially bumbling through the scene. But the scene is simultaneous. It's all happening at once. So 2 kinds of awareness are happening at the same time. And this last one is a joke, so I'll let you get it. So the only way this character can get the apple is that time and space are mashed up in a way that allows him to sort of walk backwards in time. Not something you can do in a film, at least in the same way. So I want to get the sense that they offer different capacities for storytelling. And so this is back to my own work. This was in my chapter on ruts, and I was contrasting the typical out and back commute with my wife's commute in Manhattan, where she went to different places throughout the day and it was changing every day. And if I don't think of my work as illustration, but if I were illustrating, I would say, well, here's one and here's the other, and just contrasted them. But I wanted to find a way to embody, to have the page embody the whole idea. So in the background, you can see the grid itself has the same repeated commute. So I've drawn it there, but the background is going boom, boom, boom. It's got the same repeated pattern. And in the foreground, her commute, which is scattered, it's all mapped out on her thing, but it is drifting across in the sort of way I thought about her movement through the city, and the way that I thought Manhattan looked a little bit like a leaf or a feather. So I think that way of how do we make the page, how do we make the very way you read it feel the way you're trying to express becomes a big part for me. This is not in the book. This is a page for the Boston Globe on entropy. And again, this is about entropy. There's a lot of high science in it, but I didn't use any of the words because I wanted people to read it, but also, so you can get it if you know the science, and you can get it if you don't, but I hope it works for both. But in the top part, it's very sort of linear things. We're talking about entropy as things fall apart, things run downhill, mountains crumble, your coffee gets cold. But I was also talking about the moments when things sort of go against entropy, the few moments like life where things sort of push back up against it. And so the very reading of this page itself, it spirals down and then asks you to read both right to left at some point and then bottom to top. So it's asking you to make some different moves, which are a little difficult to do, difficult to plan mostly. But I think it sort of challenges how we experience reading. And so a big question for me, and if it was a smaller group, I'd ask this question, but is what do our thoughts look like before we put them down? And I suspect that no one here, if we ask this, will say rows and rows of text. I think I don't know what they look like, but I think they have tangents. I think they make a lot of sense to you when you're out running, when you start to make connections, and they're often a lot harder when you're supposed to put them down in those rows of text. And I think comics, this is Chris Ware, a contemporary cartoonist, allow for the sort of linear moments, but also the tangential and the sort of interconnected ways that our thoughts work. And so to me, I think comics are this incredibly powerful way to represent the complexity of our ideas. And I think when you start to think about them in this sort of almost diagram fashion, they start to overlap with a lot of the things I've seen today. So I want to give one more example of that. I got asked by the journal Nature to do a piece for the climate talks in November. And I'll just take it through a tiny bit of it. The struggle for this was we were going to condense 25 years of climate talk history and the science and a few other aspects of it in an 8-page comic. And I needed to find something that held it together. I wasn't going to do a bunch of talking heads that talked us through it. I needed to find some metaphorical things. Because I already had the Eiffel Tower in mind, because that's where the talk's in Paris. I started thinking about that. I started thinking about building the Apollo project and the scaffolding to get to the moon. And so the idea of a structure that they're building became really salient to me. A structure that they're building that they are making progress on, but is also way, way too slow, because that's a big problem with what's going on in climate talks. And what was interesting to me, and this, you guys may relate to this, is that I pitched this whole idea about framework, and I kept sending them sketches, and I have these frames that go through it, and nobody understood what I was doing back at Nature. They was like, they didn't see it at all, and my sketches were pretty sketchy. And in my own work, and I don't quite know why they didn't know this, but the 1992 climate conference in Brazil was called the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I happened to find the reference for this thing, and I was like, okay, I've been drawing this thing about frameworks, and there it is. So that seemed to put us over the top. So just a few more sketches, not that you need to see them. And this piece, this is a sort of struggle. I try to find things that, there's a nice definition of comics that calls them not prose plus illustration, but rather poetry plus graphic design. And I really subscribe to that. I really think that my goal is to both get across really dense ideas, but have the aesthetics of the page move you in that way as well. And it was a bit of a struggle to sort of take all the ideas that we had to do in a short time and short space. But I think using this metaphor, making a story that sort of ran through it without talking about it, worked well. And so like I said, I think comics are tremendously powerful for how we represent the complexity of our thinking and of our ideas. But the flip side, and I think this ties in well to Catherine's talk, is that they're a powerful way to generate our thinking. And so your eyes, every second right now, are darting around 3 times a second, and they're finding edges. They're making relationships. That's what happens. I know you're in front of you, and I'm doing that all the time. That's what your eyes do. And so the minute I make a mark on a piece of paper, my eyes start to go to work and see things in the drawing that I did not have intended. So we mentioned Barbara Tversky earlier today. I was actually a professor of mine. Does a lot of work on drawing, and she talks about drawing as a conversation with yourself. And I really feel that way. I feel like my work exists because I got to have this conversation with my sketches. Rather than keeping it in my head, I made marks, and the relationship between the marks taught me where I was going. So I get this question a lot. What did you start with first, words or pictures? And I say yes. And it's because that's how it is. So it's this mess, it's this marks, and I start to see things I didn't anticipate. And I think my comics are very much smarter, in whatever way we use the word smart now, very much smarter than I am because they teach me where to go, because my eyes are now part of the feedback equation. So just take a slightly longer look at this page. And I'll say this was prompted by Shakespeare's Rose by Any Other Name Would Smell as Sweet. So I was thinking about the lousy name that comics are stuck with, which I have embraced. And I was going to make every single panel have something to do with a rose. So I have this sort of framing structure for it. And so the first one is sort of a transition. So I'm like, well, a juncture is a transition, and we have a juncture in the rose bush. So I can't tell you if I thought of the juncture word first or the piece or the drawing first, but I can say that this whole thing is generated by that back and forth, and the reading of it is also becomes a generation between that back and forth. And I was really pleased that Harvard reproduced some of my sketches in the back of the book, and I put a lot more on my website. This was the very first sort of roadmap, and I know we saw mind maps this morning as well. But I think what's key in this is not to say that this is sort of a representation of thinking, is to say that this is my thinking. This is where the thinking happens in here. I mean, sure, I have ideas in my head, but it's really in putting them down and discovering with them. So I want to share one more story of mine before we get to the close of this. In the chapter on imagination, I have a page about stories, which is appropriate for this audience. And from the very start, I thought about Scheherazade and the Arabian Nights and their stories within stories. And so I was playing, people are familiar with the book Zoom, perhaps, a sort of kid's book where you like zoom in. A few of you, there's a postcard, and you like zoom in on the postcard, and they're watching TV, and then you just keep going. Powers of 10 by the Eames, the film and book, is kind of similar. So I was kind of playing with that. I was going to have stories within stories, and like each panel was going to relate to the one before by either literal or metaphorical zoom. But midway through the page, I wanted to sort of shift gears and say by stories, I mean not just the fanciful, but I also mean things like science. And so if I was writing, I would have said, by stories, I mean also things like science, and put a period on it. But because I'm so interested in how I can embody it through the visual, how the images can do the work, I had to find something that made sense here. So I spent a lot of time scouring in what was done in the time period that the Arabian Nights were collected and in the area that they were written, and came across a sort of obscure work by a man named Al-Tusi, which his observations were picked up 300 years later by Copernicus, that helped him make his big revolution. And I already had this page about Copernicus, which I said nothing changed except the point of view, which changed everything. And I was like, was super excited. So I spent a couple weeks for this single page, both learning the astronomy and the mathematics well enough so I could make sense of it, and working through the sketches so that I could have this flow, so that I could have the page do what it was supposed to and the images work. For what's all about those 3 lower panels, we can blow it up. And it's those 3 panels. And so you could say that's a ridiculous thing to do on deadline, which is true. But I think what's really important about it is to say, in working visually, in allowing other ways to work, that I went directions that I wouldn't have gone. It forced me to learn things I wouldn't have learned. And I think that's a big point of where my work has gone, is it's not just about making it accessible, and it's that it actually changes how we think. And I want to share one student example. It's quite different than my work, but I think it's really stuck with me. So I teach comics classes mostly to people who describe themselves as non-drawers, and this girl certainly would say that. Non-drawer and really a non-talker. And her skills are not what I want to point out here, but I really want to point out how much her thinking is on display. You don't have to read it all to see that, but you'll see it here in where she's trying to figure out the boxes that she's fit in, and she's playing with the comic book form as both container and frame. And trying, and the last page I think is really powerful here. So she makes her own box out of words, sounds, and pictures, and soon she learns that there is no need for borders, that boxes restrict her unnecessarily since she can go anywhere she wishes. And I feel like that, I mean, this, as a piece of art, I don't know, if you graded somebody on her artistic skill, I'm not sure that it's there. But if you grade somebody, which I don't really believe in, on her thinking, I think this opened up her thinking in really powerful ways. And I can say that is what it was for me. So I feel like my research journey, my work, because I included the visual, it didn't allow me to illustrate it. It allowed me to change how I think, and it allowed my thinking to be a journey. And I think I want to close with that, just to say I think the importance of the work you're doing, the importance of making the visual part of what we do, allows, and other modes, allows us to go in the directions we need to go and become the people that I think we can become. So thank you. So I guess some questions, and then we'll draw. I don't actually know what time it is. Of course, I have a watch, so I can do that. So we got like 10, if you have questions. Maybe nobody does.
Yeah, questions?
I've answered all of them. I've never. All right.
What got you into comics? Like, what made you want to start drawing your own comics? What was the appeal?
Why did I start? Well, I mean, I started when I was 1, so I just always did. And I like it, and I think the important part is that I didn't turn away completely, but that I think I sort of suppressed it for a longer time than I wish I had. And I think that my thinking is a lot better when I allow both the drawing and the words to be part of it. So, I don't know, I just like it. I think better that way.
Hi.
I don't know where that voice came from.
Right over here.
Hey, I was going to talk to you.
Yeah.
You made a comics reference earlier.
Yeah. I'm not sure. It's not really a question as much as a statement, but you talked about the importance of sort of peripheral vision and being able to see sort of several frames in one go, seeing the visual and the words at the same time. And it's a huge problem that I struggle with when designing for mobile, because it forces you to show just one thing at a time, and it forces you to go through things really, really linearly.
Yes.
And I don't have a good solution for it.
Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, I think because for those who read comics on their phone, the Comixology and other places have made these apps where you can sort of scroll through panel by panel. And I think, for me, as you saw on my pages, I'm so concerned with the whole that would destroy it. And the Boston Globe actually tried, I'm not sure with that one, but the one before, they're like, how can we put this for the mobile app? And I'm like, good luck with that. There's nothing about it that allows you to do it. So I think it's, for comics, it's sort of an interesting moment. There's so much more interest in them, but because of digital things sort of eating them up and things like that, they don't work that well in that form without losing, I think, some of what makes them exciting. But lots of people invent natively for those forms. And the other thing is, you guys are much more tech savvy than I am. This size thing isn't going to last forever. I mean, we're going to have something else in 5 years. So if you completely change what you're doing in the medium just because you want to fit this little box, what's going to happen when it's projected? I don't know, whatever's next. So I don't know. I'd like to talk to you more about it. Yeah. Or I don't.
Steve Fenn.
Hey, Steve.
Just so as a fan of comics, are there particular artists, writers that you feel kind of
push the genre to what it's capable of? I know that's a pretty broad thing, but if you can just think of one or two recommendations.
I certainly can. There's David Mazzucchelli, who got famous as a daredevil and then a Batman artist as a young man and then quit. Did a book in the 90s. It's an adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass. And it's a really stunning book. His use of metaphorical imagery definitely had a big influence on me. Didn't do a lot in between, or at least not a lot that people have seen. And did a book in 2009 called Asterius Polyp. It's really a stunning, stunning visual. I mean, his use of color, his use of change in font from character to character. It's really, when I talk about, especially with education people, about multimodality, the book is like the best example of the importance of multimodality, because every character is drawn differently. They'll have different colors. Their fonts and word balloons are different things. I mean, it's very simplified cartooning. I mean, it's very few lines. I mean, it's not much different than Peanuts, but well, it is different than Peanuts, but at least in its simplicity it is. But it showcases all those things. And the other one I mentioned to someone last night, Richard McGuire has a book called Here that came out last, I guess, 2014. And it's pretty. It deals with the time and space issue pretty well. And it's one corner of his parents' living room, their living room he grew up in. And instead of sort of a story unfolding in time, I guess in space, nothing ever moves. The entire comic is focused on that corner. And sometimes you're in the past, sometimes you're in the future, and he's overlaying within each page. There may be like many time frames just sitting on top, but they're always in the exact location. So maybe it's before the house was built. Maybe it's in the future when, you know, some imaginary creatures are roaming around. But that use of sort of comic as time and comic as a different exploration of time, I think is really powerful. So those are two.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Sally Jackson. I work at a community college, and I confess I'm not a comic book reader.
I still like you.
And I apologize because I was very impressed by your presentation, and I'm still trying to process a lot of this. One of my concerns the reason I came is that I do institutional research and trying to find ways of presenting data to faculty administrators. And in this world of big data, I worry about the dehumanization of our students because of the ease of turning them into numbers and risk scores and things of that nature. And this just seems like a way of being able to tell the student experience with this via graphics, with the support of data that would humanize them, and a way of moving away from the inherent biases we bring. Well, students don't succeed because they're lazy, they're not committed, they're underprepared, you know, to pick your negative thing. Do you ever work with faculty, with academics, to help them think differently and see how they can utilize this in a way of, challenging some of the traditional ways of understanding information so that it can kind of expand and help them move beyond the stereotypes?
Yeah. No, I mean, I do all the time. Mostly via Skype and stuff like that. But I think, the classes I taught back at Columbia were for teachers who then used comics in their classroom, which is so interesting. Thinking of my own career as somebody who, you weren't allowed to do comics in school. The sort of humanities didn't like comics, but I think the artists liked comics even less because it was low art. So you really couldn't do it in school. So to see 20 years later that now people who have no experience with comics teach it to students, and students eat it up. They really do. And I don't think they eat it up because it's simple. I think they eat it up for a different reason that we could talk about longer. So, I'm happy to talk with you and send resources. Yes. Exhaust your questions.
More questions?
Hey, Nelson Davis. Just real quick, I'm curious if you just walk through a workflow and the tools that you use. The work is beautiful, but it looks like some of it's pencil sketch. some of it looks digital. Just, have you shifted over the course of time and whatnot?
All my design work is done on graph paper for hours, and most of my time is spent designing things, designing flow, designing how all the pieces fit together and what the pieces are. As it turns out, this is a page on multimodality, which I have the whole breakdown, if you have any great interest to see it. My idea for multimodality was to start with an omelet. It didn't work. Didn't go the direction I wanted to. And I know I sketched a lot more. I think I was still in the omelet here. And I accidentally drew this. And this is really where I think the idea that you discover things in your own drawings. Tversky's work is all about that the sketcher themselves sees things in their drawing they didn't intend, especially when you keep it loose. But I noticed at some point that the way I'd drawn the sort of grid on the brain was a lot like a keyboard typewriter, or an orchestra pit, which I think are almost the same. I think early typewriters look like orchestra pits, and that sort of the space bar is the conductor. And if you start thinking about that. So I started noticing all these connections, really because of my drawing, not because of anything I was doing. And I'll just show you one more part. The problem with comics, one of the challenges of the constraint of using the page is that if I move you down, it's hard to move you back up. So I had this little, if you can see in the upper left, there's little 3 panels. It's like an intro paragraph, if you think about it that way. And then, but then I wanted to restart at the top of the head. It was a difficult move to do. And in comics, you're really not supposed to use arrows. It's kind of cheating. So I have this, you can see here that I sort of have the arrow. And I'm playing with that. And I think somewhere in there I noticed how much that the arrow could look like a thumb. And since I don't know if you can see it up there. I can. That's why maybe you can see it here. So arrow becomes thumb because I noticed it, and since I was already playing with the keyboard, I'm like, oh my goodness, well, why didn't I think of that? It's pretty obvious once you've done it. And then the page started to come together. So the thumb's there, and the final page, this. And so I work on paper forever, and then at some point I switched to digitally. I draw in Photoshop. I can't letter. I failed handwriting in 6th grade or something, and I haven't recovered from that. So it made my ability to letter and have it translated and edit, because it's an academic work, it's better to be able to do that. It's a little more than you asked for, but one more and then we draw, or should we just draw? Oh, one more.
Sarah Murphy. I work at The Ohio State University, which has a cartoon library.
The best on the planet.
The largest in the world.
Michigan State's might be bigger, though.
I don't know. We'll find out.
I said yours is the best. I didn't.
It's pretty big. It's really big. So anyway, so our library uses comics often with students to teach comics, looking at it from a primary source perspective. I just thought your example of the student and her self-discovery journey, that was quite interesting to me, and I was just wondering if you could comment on the assignment, what you asked her to do.
Well, that was their final, so it was really open, and that was only part of it. But I'll just give you the short version of what I usually start with in class is what we're all going to do right in a minute. And then I do a lot of things that are sort of constraint-based or sort of factor. I let them bring whatever content they want to it, but I constrain for form. So, for instance, tell the story of how you got here in 3 panels or 2 in 2 pages, which they can interpret how they want. So with that right there starts to teach them, well, if I do it in 3 panels, I make these kind of decisions. What do I choose to show? Then I do it in 2 pages. I have more space. I can play with things. Sometimes the stories aren't the same stories. Sometimes the stories are about each other instead of, so they really start to invent their own things and start to discover more about the theory just in the act of making, which is something I try to foreground all my classes with the making first, because I think they'll teach them, so much more than you think you know when you start doing it. So we do a lot of things like that. There's a wonderful book by Matt Madden called 99 Ways to Tell a Story, where he does a 1-page comic about going to look for something in the refrigerator and forgetting what he was looking for. And then he does 98 versions of the same story where he does one in reverse order. He does one with the narrator rather than himself. He does one from his first-person perspective, one from the refrigerator's perspective, one in the style of manga, he goes through exhaustive amount of variation. So I think playing with that starts to open up possibilities. So we do things that relate to those two things I mentioned. But the final was, this is a terrible description of it, do something that relates to the stuff we did in class, and it can be in comics form or comics-like form, and the only thing is that me and them had to agree on what it is they did. So it was really open-ended. And some people, one person produced a 64-page, and he's quite professional in his cartooning, 64-page comic on dealing with depression is sort of a helpful guide. Some of them did personal things like this, and some did. I had some InfoViz people in my class, and one did a augmented reality comic book. So the diversity of projects is all over the place. Okay, can we draw? You guys are up for it? So all you need, that little that piece of paper you got should do it. Let me see if I got slides for this. Okay, so comics. This is me. You can all do this. Comics, unlike storyboards often get equated with comics, right? And you think, and so in one sense they're sort of similar in that you got to think about what goes on in the frame. But comics, you not only have to think about what goes on in the frame, you have to think about the size of the panel, the shape of the panel, what it's next to, what it's not next to, its orientation. So it becomes a much more spatial equation. So this little Nemo page, if I whited out the content, even there, you could sort of tell things were regular, things grew, and then things really grew. You can sort of feel the staccato beat to this thing. This is from The Dark Knight, very famous Batman comic. Again, if I whited out the content, you'd sort of feel the cinematic heartbeat of that, the left side. And the other one is much more fractured and open. And this is a piece called W3, but drawn by Frank Quitely, and you can kind of feel its freneticness, so all those overlapping things. It's in there. And usually I would have you look at the ceiling tiles, but there are no ceiling tiles here. But if you pretend for just a second, we'll look at the window. If you can see the window, the door window thing over there. If you imagine putting it to music, you could sort of go ba, ba, ba. Maybe we hit this wooden stuff up here with the little, I don't know what they are. And you go da-da-da-da-da-da. And you have long spaces. So anyway, you can imagine a ceiling tile that's not as nice as this, but different. If you think about how the way that time is represented in space that way, what I want you to do is come down to your piece of paper and think about the shape of your day in the way a comics page does, in the way grids that you might see in Manhattan or anywhere that you see grids. And some way to carve up this sheet of paper that represents the shape of your day. And it can be today. It can be yesterday. It can be an ordinary day. It can be an extraordinary day. It should be based in reality. So that's the first half of the prompt, and I'll tell you the second. And the second doesn't always work, but I'll tell you anyway. As I was thinking of this exercise, I'm out for a run on a regular grid, and I noticed that paint had been spilled across it. And I like the exercise, but I feel like it's missing a little bit of narrative content. My wife is an abstract gestural painter, throws paint at things, and that captures her activity and her emotional state. And so what I'd like you to think about is you carve up this sheet of paper into the shape of your day and then inhabit it in some way with marks or lines or gestures that represent what you were up to or how you felt in that space. Does that make sense? The only other two caveats are use the entire page. If you want to leave something blank, it counts. This is not writing where you get halfway down and you just say, well, my paragraph's over. The negative space counts. And also, do your best not to draw things. Because you only got 5 minutes to do this. Try to stay away from drawing things. So, does it make sense?
Things. You can't draw things.
Well, like you don't have to draw. You don't need to draw stick figures or things like that. Lines or marks can represent your activity. Someone in here will. I know that many people will anyway. Okay, you got 5 minutes. Get going. Okay, and whether you're finished, I'm live again. If you're finished or not, could you turn to your table and share for about a minute? See what other people did? Okay, so I'm just going to stop you for a second. You guys can keep this up, but you're supposed to leave and stuff. You should be running to the door, but I appreciate that. I'm going to just I mean, in 5 minutes, everybody made an enormous amount of decisions. And I'm really excited about that. And I would pick on everybody, but that would probably be unwieldy. And there's no way you're going to see this, but Steve, just tell us. So Steve's is, which way is the top? This is Steve's, and I'm picking these semi-randomly because everybody's done something different. I don't think anybody's looks the same. Steve, tell me just why you did a diagonal. Anybody other diagonals like this? In the whole room? There was 1, 2, there's a couple other diagonals. Okay, tell me why, and then we'll look at you, Mike. Well,
For the interest of time, I didn't think I could fill up an entire grid with the approach that I wanted. And I also felt like... I also felt like I could kind of map out my day-to-day work, but also have things jutting out for the distractions that hit. And so being able to fill up the space that way. So I had a little pattern to represent work time, a little pattern to represent the distractions, a little pattern to represent where I'm distracted by both work and normal distractions during lunch with my family, and then a little Z's at the top and the bottom for coming in and out of sleep.
Nice. And so he invented this all on the spot. No, I mean, you don't make these all the time, right? No. All right, what's your Florian? So just top. I just want to know about the difference between he's got these long spaces and then these little punctuated spaces. Very intentional.
Yeah. So those are the coffee breaks and the distractions, just like Steve's distractions. They're all rectangular. I guess subconsciously I was influenced by my Outlook calendar. That's how I see my day.
Yeah.
In blocks of time.
But you made that's a lot of this. I mean, it's very simple. It's not like this took a lot of drawing skill. No offense. But those spaces mean something. And he made those decisions. Have you made comics before?
Nope.
Okay, good. Can I take that? Sorry. Can you? Cynthia.
So
she's just going to tell us about this and this. The rise and fall.
Oh, the rise and fall is me laying in bed this morning trying to decide whether to come down to the conference or stay in bed. The high points are when I'm staying in bed, and the low points are when I'm thinking about getting out of it.
So it needs some interpretation, possibly, I really want to know about this.
And that's, so each one of the boxes in the back represents all of the cool and interesting different things that I've experienced today. And then over all of those is a dark box that represents sort of this overshadowing thing that's external from this conference that kind of has loomed over my day.
But look at that. There's the boxes. You can see something in these lines feel pretty active, they feel happy, whatever that means. This doesn't. This clearly doesn't feel it, and it overlaps. So she's made, that's whether you knew anything about her, whether you even knew who this was, you would look at that part and say, I walked up to her and I said, what happened? Which, fortunately, she didn't tell me, and I should probably be careful about that. But how much we know already. So the reason that this was supposed to teach you a little bit about how you think about the space of a comics page. And I think it does that. But I think it also teaches you how much you know. I'm in a room where a lot of you probably draw, so that's a different room than normal. But how much you know and how much you can figure out like that. Is anybody desperate to share something about theirs? And then we probably should wrap this up. And if not, we can... Like you all talked about it, I couldn't even stop you from talking, and then I ask you and you say nothing. It's nice. Anybody? Or should we be done?
It's a great exercise.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much, Nate.